The first responding officer threw up in the front yard. He'd been on the force for 12 years, had seen the aftermath of highway wrecks that turned steel into twisted ribbons, had stood in rooms where domestic violence had painted the walls in shades no human should ever witness. He had carried children out of house fires and held the hands of the dying while ambulances screamed through city streets. But nothing, had prepared him for the smell that poured out of that suburban split level. It was the kind of odor that doesn't just enter your nostrils, it invades you. It clings to the back of your throat, sweet and rotten all at once, the unmistakable signature of something that should never be inside a home. Something that had been left too long. Something that had become part of the air itself. The call had come in as a wellness check, one of those routine dispatches that usually ends with a sheepish elderly resident who forgot to charge their phone or a family on vacation who didn't think to tell the neighbors. But this one was different. The neighbor who called, a woman named Carol who had lived across the street for 17 years, reported that the blinds hadn't been opened in 4 days. The mail was spilling out of the slot, an accumulation of bills and flyers that looked like a white flag of surrender. And the family's elderly Labrador, a gentle yellow dog named Gus, had been seen pacing the backyard, whining at the sliding glass door with a persistence that Carol described as heartbreaking. Gus was never left outside. His owner, Nora Whitman, treated that dog like a child. For him to be out there alone, in the cold, for hours on end, was a violation of everything the neighborhood knew about the quiet woman who lived at 1427 Maple Drive, when the officer forced the lock, a simple deadbolt that gave way with a crack that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. He stepped into a foyer that felt less like a home and more like a museum exhibit frozen in amber. The air was thick, heavy, and the Labrador was the first thing he saw. Gus was trembling in the corner, his ribs visible beneath his thinning coat. His tail tucked so far between his legs it touched his belly. His leash was still attached to his collar, a red nylon strap that dragged behind him, and tangled at the end was a plastic bag of waste, as if the last person to hold that leash had been about to take him for a walk and then simply stopped existing. The officer called out Nora's name. His voice echoed off walls that seemed to swallow the sound. No answer. He moved further in, his hand resting on the grip of his service weapon, his flashlight beam cutting through the dim light of a house where every curtain was drawn. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and that was where his blood ran cold. On the kitchen table, illuminated by a single pendant light that someone had left on, was a place setting arranged with unnatural precision. A porcelain plate, white with a delicate blue trim, sat at the center. A crystal glass, filled with water that had long since gone flat, stood to the right. A cloth napkin, folded into a perfect triangle, rested beside it. And on the plate, untouched, was a slice of homemade pie. The crust was golden, the edges crimped with the care of someone who took pride in small things. The filling was a deep, dark cherry red that glistened under the light, and for a moment, just a moment, the officer's mind refused to process what he was seeing. It was the pie that made him call for backup. It was the pie that made him step back out onto the front porch and lean against the railing, his stomach heaving, because he knew, with a certainty that sat like ice in his chest, that this was not a disappearance. This was a message. Someone had set that table. Someone had sliced that pie. And that someone had been inside this house long after Nora Whitman had stopped breathing. Her name was Nora Whitman, and she was the kind of woman who made the world feel softer just by being in it. 51 years old, a high school librarian with a voice that could calm a room full of rowdy teenagers and a smile that appeared in the yearbook every year as the faculty member most likely to remember your name. She had dedicated her life to stories, the ones in books, but also the ones in the people around her. Students who had graduated a decade earlier still came back to visit her, still asked for book recommendations, still remembered the way she would pull a worn paperback from her shelf and say, "This one changed me. Maybe it'll change you, too." She kept a stash of granola bars in her desk for kids who hadn't eaten breakfast, a box of mittens in her closet for those who arrived at school without them, and a policy that no student ever left her library feeling invisible. Her colleagues described her as a creature of gentle routine, someone who found comfort in the small rituals that made up a life. Morning coffee on the back porch, always in the same ceramic mug with a faded picture of a cat on it. A walk with Gus before the sun came up, when the streets were quiet and the world still felt like it belonged to her. Dinner at 6:30 sharp, always alone, always content. She had been widowed a decade earlier, her husband David taken by a sudden heart attack that left her with nothing but a paid-off house, a grieving Labrador, and a quiet resilience that impressed everyone who knew her. David had been a high school history teacher, a man with a booming laugh and a habit of leaving his shoes in the middle of the hallway. They had met in the teacher's lounge, bonded over a mutual disdain for the vending machine coffee, and built a life that was unremarkable in the best possible way. When he died, Nora's friends expected her to crumble. Instead, she planted a garden. She poured her grief into the soil, and every spring, her yard exploded with marigolds and zinnias and daffodils that the neighbors would stop to admire. She never remarried, never even dated, telling friends that she had already had her great love and didn't need another. What she needed, she said, was her garden, her books, and her dog. Gus was her constant companion, the only living creature that shared her bed, her routines, her silences. She talked to him like he was a person, and in many ways, he was. He was the last thread that connected her to David. The final piece of the life they had built together. So when Gus was found cowering in the foyer, his leash still attached, his food bowl empty for 4 days, his eyes hollow with confusion and fear, the investigators knew immediately that whatever had happened to Nora Whitman had happened while she was in the middle of her most sacred ritual, the evening walk that she had taken every single night for the past 10 years, never missing a single one, rain or shine. Until that Thursday when she vanished into the thin air of her own driveway. Detective Marcus Cole was assigned to the case, and if there was ever a man built for the quiet horror of a mystery like this, it was him. 47 years old. With a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and eyes that had stopped being surprised by human cruelty a long time ago, Cole had spent 2 decades navigating the dark currents of homicide investigations. He had solved cases that other detectives had written off as unsolvable, not because he was smarter than them, but because he was willing to sit in the discomfort of unanswered questions longer than anyone else. He trusted the small details over the grand theories, believed that the truth was always hiding in the things people overlooked. He spent the first 48 hours of the investigation tracing Nora's final movements with the meticulousness of a historian reconstructing a lost civilization. Her credit card showed a purchase at the local grocery store at 4:12 p.m., a single slice of cherry pie from the bakery section, which explained the untouched slice on the table. The cashier remembered her, remembered commenting on how nice it was to see someone treating themselves, and remembered that Nora had been alone, had smiled, had said she was looking forward to a quiet night with a good book. Her phone record showed a call to her closest friend, a woman named Diane, at 5:45 p.m., a brief conversation about weekend plans that ended with Nora saying, "I'm just going to take Gus for his walk and then settle in. Call you tomorrow." The last ping from her cell phone placed it inside the house at 6:22 p.m. Then, silence. No calls, no texts, no movement. The front door was locked from the inside, the deadbolt engaged. The back door was also locked, with a heavy security bar in place that Nora had installed after David's death, a thick piece of steel that braced against the frame and made it impossible to open from the outside. The windows were sealed, the alarm system was armed with a code that only Nora knew, and the only key to the front door was found on a hook in the kitchen, exactly where she always left it. By every physical measure, the house was a fortress. And yet, Nora Whitman had walked out that front door with her dog, prepared for an evening stroll, and had simply ceased to exist before she even made it to the sidewalk. The dog, Gus, had been found inside the house. That meant someone had brought the dog back in, locked the door, and left the leash attached. It meant someone had taken the time to set the table, to slice the pie, to create that unnerving tableau in the kitchen. It meant the killer had not just taken a life, they had staged a scene. And the more Detective Cole dug, the more he realized that the scene was not meant to mislead the police. It was meant to be found. It was a signature. A calling card. A way of saying, I was here, and I know you. I know your routines, your rituals, your weaknesses. I was inside your life, and you never even noticed. The investigation initially focused on the obvious suspects, the low-hanging fruit that any homicide detective would pluck first. The ex-boyfriend from 20 years ago, a man named Randall who had resurfaced on social media with cryptic comments about Nora's late husband, posts that read like the ramblings of someone who had never quite let go. Randall was brought in for questioning, his hands cuffed behind his back, his eyes darting around the interrogation room like a trapped animal. He had an alibi, he was at a bar 20 miles away, and the bartender remembered him because he had tried to pay with a $20 bill that turned out to be counterfeit. The alibi checked out. The disgruntled former student was next. A young man named Kyle who had been expelled from the high school for bringing a weapon onto campus, a knife he claimed was for protection but that the administration treated as a threat. Kyle had shouted obscenities at Nora in the library the day he was expelled, had blamed her for reporting him, had promised she would regret it. But Kyle had been in a juvenile detention facility for the past 8 months, serving time for an unrelated offense. His name was on a roster, his presence accounted for. Then there was the contractor, a man named Vince who had done work on the house the previous summer, replacing the roof and fixing a leak in the basement. Vince had made a few too many comments about Nora living alone. Had lingered too long at the front door after the checks were signed, had asked if she needed anything else. His alibi was his wife, who swore he was home with her the night Nora vanished. The wife's eyes were steady, her voice unwavering, and there was no evidence to contradict her. Each lead was pursued with the full weight of the department, and each one fizzled into nothing, leaving Detective Cole standing in the middle of Nora's living room, staring at the untouched slice of pie, feeling like he was missing something that was right in front of his face, but what the forensic team found in the master bedroom would shift the entire trajectory of the investigation. Beneath Nora's pillow, tucked into a silk pillowcase that still faintly smelled of her lavender lotion, they discovered a small leather journal. It was not a diary in the traditional sense, it contained no emotional outpourings, no secrets of the heart, no confessions of loneliness or longing. Instead, it was a logbook. A record. Every entry was a date, a time, and a single sentence, written in Nora's neat, looping handwriting. Today he smiled at me. Today he said my name. Today he asked if I needed anything from the store. The entries spanned months, all describing interactions with one person, a man identified only as J. There was no full name, no description, no context that would help an investigator identify him. But the entries were obsessive in their specificity, unsettling in their accumulation. Today he noticed I was tired and offered to carry my groceries. Today he waited by my mailbox until I came out. Today he asked about David. The tone shifted over time, moving from mild curiosity to something darker, something that read like fear dressed in the language of observation. Today he was in the backyard when I came home. He said he was looking for a lost ball. Today he asked if I was ever lonely. Today he said I shouldn't trust everyone who comes to my door. Detective Cole read the entries 3 times, each pass deepening the chill that had settled in his bones. These were not the words of a woman cataloging a romance. They were the words of someone being watched. Someone who did not know they were being watched, but who had begun to suspect. Someone who was keeping a record because she was afraid that one day she might need proof. And then the entries stopped. The last date was 3 days before she vanished. The final sentence was unfinished, trailing off into a smudge of ink that looked like her hand had been pulled away from the page before she could complete the thought. Detective Cole ran the details through every database, cross-referenced with neighbors, friends, family, anyone whose name began with J. He found nothing. He brought in a forensic linguist to analyze the handwriting, hoping for clues about the psychological state of the observer. He pulled phone records, looking for calls to anyone with a J initial. He spent hours in Nora's neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen a man lingering, watching, waiting. Most of the neighbors shook their heads, offering only the usual platitudes about what a nice woman Nora was, how quiet the street was, how nothing like this had ever happened before. But one neighbor, an elderly man who lived 2 doors down, mentioned something that made Cole's pulse quicken. He said he had seen a young man walking Gus on several occasions, a young man he didn't recognize, a young man who seemed to know the dog well but who never stopped to chat, never made eye contact, just walked the dog with his head down and disappeared back inside the house. Cole asked if Nora had mentioned hiring a dog walker. The neighbor shrugged. He assumed it was a relative, a nephew, someone she trusted. He never thought to ask. On the 3rd day of the investigation, Diane, the best friend, came to the station with a trembling voice and a piece of information she had been too afraid to share until now. She explained that Nora had been acting strange in the weeks before her disappearance. She had become paranoid, convinced that someone was watching her house at night, that the blinds were being moved, that the garden had been disturbed. Diane had urged her to call the police, but Nora refused. She said she didn't want to sound crazy. She said she didn't want to be the kind of woman who called the cops because she felt uneasy. But she had confided one thing to Diane that she hadn't written in the journal: she suspected the person watching her was someone she knew. Someone close. Someone who had access to her home, her schedule, her routines. And when Diane asked who, Nora had only whispered a single word: Gus's walker. The dog walker. A young man named Jason Hartley. 23 years old, a college student majoring in criminal justice at the local university, a quiet young man who lived alone in a basement apartment 3 miles from Nora's house. He had been hired 6 months earlier through a flyer he had posted at the grocery store, a simple advertisement offering dog walking services for $15 an hour. Nora had hired him because her schedule at the library had changed, forcing her to work later on Thursdays, and she didn't want Gus to be alone for so long. Jason had come for an interview, had sat at her kitchen table, had listened politely as she explained Gus's routine, his favorite walking route, his tendency to pull on the leash when he saw squirrels. Jason had smiled, nodded, asked if she had any extra keys he could use. She had given him a key. She had given him the security code. She had given him access to her home, her dog, her life. And for 6 months, he had been inside her house, sometimes when she was there, sometimes when she wasn't. He had seen the photographs on her walls, the books on her shelves, the journal beneath her pillow. He had memorized her schedule, her habits, her vulnerabilities. And according to the logbook she had kept, he had been escalating. Today he asked if I was ever lonely. Today he said I shouldn't trust everyone who comes to my door. Today he was in the backyard when I came home. Detective Cole pulled Jason Hartley's file. No criminal record. No red flags. Clean, quiet, invisible. The perfect profile for someone who had been hiding in plain sight. Cole drove to Jason's apartment with a warrant and a heavy sense of dread that had settled into his chest like a stone. The building was a nondescript brick structure on a street lined with similar nondescript structures. The kind of place where people came and went without anyone noticing. The landlord let him in, a nervous man with a ring of keys that jingled in his trembling hand. The apartment was pristine, almost unnervingly so. The bed was made with military precision. The dishes were washed and stacked in perfect alignment. The air smelled of bleach and something else, something faintly sweet that Cole couldn't identify. But the closet told the story. Behind a false panel that had been expertly installed, hidden in a space that would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, was a shrine. Photographs of Nora Whitman covered every inch of the wall, pictures taken from a distance. Through her windows, in the grocery store, on her porch. There were close-ups of her face, blurred and grainy, as if taken through a telephoto lens while she was gardening. There were pictures of Gus, of the backyard, of the security bar on the back door. There were notes, detailed logs of her daily movements, her habits, her conversations, written in a neat, printed hand that matched the entries in Nora's journal. And there, on a small table in the center of the shrine, was a single object, a leather leash, identical to the one found still attached to Gus's collar. But it was not Gus's leash. It was new, unused, purchased 3 days before Nora vanished. Next to it was a handwritten note, the ink still fresh, the handwriting a neat, deliberate script that Cole would later describe as the most terrifying thing I've ever read. It read, "She was supposed to love me. She was supposed to let me take care of her. I did everything right. I was patient. I was kind. I never pushed. But she chose the dog over me. She chose everyone over me. So I made sure she would never leave again." The forensic team later matched fibers from that leash to the inside of Nora's car, which had been found parked in a long-term lot at the airport, a detail that had initially led investigators to believe she had fled voluntarily. But Jason had driven her car there himself, after the fact, leaving a trail that led nowhere while he returned to the house one last time to set the table, slice the pie, and lock the door behind him. Jason Hartley was arrested 3 hours later at his parents' home, where he had been attending a family dinner. He was smiling when they knocked, laughing at something his father had said, his face open and unguarded. He showed no signs of the obsession that had been festering behind his quiet eyes, no indication that he had spent the past 4 days going about his life as if nothing had happened. His parents were bewildered, protesting his innocence, insisting that their son was a good boy who would never hurt anyone. Jason sat through the arrest with a placid calm that unnerved the officers more than a violent outburst would have. During interrogation, he confessed to everything. Not with the rage of a killer caught, but with the satisfaction of a storyteller finally reaching the climax of a tale he had been crafting for months. He had been watching Nora for 6 months, he explained, convinced that her kindness was a sign of romantic interest, that her hiring him as a dog walker was the first step in a relationship she was too shy to initiate. He interpreted every smile, every thank you, every casual conversation as a promise. When she made it clear, in a moment he described as the most painful of my life, that she saw him only as an employee, that she had no romantic interest in him, that she was old enough to be his mother, his obsession curdled into something far more dangerous. He confronted her on the night of her walk, in the driveway, just as she was about to leave. He told her he loved her. He told her they were meant to be together. He told her that David would have wanted her to be happy. And when she recoiled in horror, when she told him to leave, when she threatened to call the police, he snapped. He didn't just kill her, he erased her, disposing of her remains in a location he refused to reveal for weeks, forcing her family and friends to endure a torment that no verdict could ever undo. He had brought Gus back inside because, in his warped mind, he was taking care of the dog. He was proving he could be trusted. He had set the table, sliced the pie. Because he wanted to create a scene that would be remembered, a final tableau that would cement his place in her life forever. He wanted to be the last person to have touched something of hers. The man who was supposed to be a helper, a trusted figure with a key to her home, had been meticulously planning her destruction from the moment she first smiled at him. The case against Jason was airtight. The shrine in his apartment, the journal, the fibers in the car, the confession, it was all there, laid out in a narrative so complete that the prosecution barely had to work. His defense attorney tried to argue insanity, pointing to the shrine, the obsession, the delusional belief that Nora loved him. But the jury saw through it. They heard the recorded confession, listened to the calm, deliberate way Jason described his actions, and returned a verdict of guilty on all counts in less than 4 hours. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, a sentence that his parents wept through while Jason sat motionless, his face a mask of indifference. But for Detective Cole, the case never truly closed. He still thinks about the pie on the table, the dog trembling in the corner, the journal tucked beneath the pillow. He thinks about the way the kitchen light was left on, as if someone had wanted the scene to be discovered, as if the tableau was more important than the act itself. He thinks about the illusion of safety, the locked doors, the security system, the trusted person with a key who walked past the family photos on the wall and saw not a life to protect, but a life to possess. Nora Whitman did everything right. She was cautious, she was private, she built walls around her quiet world. She hired help from a flyer at the grocery store, did a background check that came back clean, asked for references that all checked out. But she made one mistake: she trusted the wrong person. And that person, hiding in plain sight, convinced himself that her kindness was a promise she never intended to keep. The marigolds along the walkway of the house on Maple Drive have long since been uprooted. The house itself was sold, then demolished by a new owner who said they couldn't stand the memories that clung to the walls. A modern home stands there now, with security cameras on every corner and a fence that wraps around the property like a fortress. But the woman who planted those flowers, who believed that peace was just one step away on an evening walk, is remembered not for the horror of her end, but for the quiet betrayal that led her there. Because the most terrifying monsters are never the ones hiding in the shadows, never the strangers who break through windows or lurk in dark alleyways. They are the ones who know where the spare key is hidden. The ones whose faces are in the photographs we keep on our nightstands. The ones we call when we're scared, never realizing they are the reason we should be. And somewhere, in a prison cell that has become his entire world, Jason Hartley still dreams of that kitchen table, that slice of pie, that moment when he was the last person to touch something of hers. For him, the story ended exactly the way he wanted it to. For the rest of us, it's a warning written in cherry red filling and a dog's hollow eyes, a reminder that trust, when given to the wrong hands, becomes a weapon more devastating than any knife. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of the importance of listening to that quiet voice in the back of your mind that whispers when something feels wrong, then take a moment to subscribe to Behind the Crime Files. Hit that notification bell and join a community that believes in honoring the victims by never forgetting the truths their stories reveal. Drop a comment below. What would you have done differently if you were in Nora's shoes? We read every single response, and your voice matters in keeping these conversations alive. Subscribe now, and never miss a deep dive into the cases that change the way we see the world.